Let mutual love abide. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Amen. What wonderful readings we have for this Sunday. Amazing readings which really get to the heart of what it means to be a Christian and how we are called to live our lives, both on an ethical and moral, philosophical plane, but also on a theological and prayerful day-to-day existence. And the readings today are so powerful because they are so basic and intrinsic to our everyday experience. They are readings, especially the New Testament reading from the Gospel according to St. Luke, which speaks of this concept of hospitality. Hospitality, what it means to be hospitable, to give graciousness, and to give kindness to those around us. And the special type of hospitality and grace that happens with a meal. Now, of course, we may be thinking of the Holy Meal, which in a few moments we are all going to participate in. We may be thinking about some of the big meals that we've all had around Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter. But I want you to think about a recent meal you might have had with family or friends, nothing fancy, but an everyday type of meal that you shared with those who are close to you. And notice how even in the ordinary experience of everyday life, something we may frequently take for granted, even in the most basic of meal, there's this opportunity of hospitality and grace, isn't there? An opportunity where we just sit together and be with each other. In a culture that is so frantic and frenetic, and on to the next thing, we have this holy space and this holy time just to be with one another. And what a special thing that is. And the opportunity maybe to ask each other, how was your day? How are you doing? To connect, and maybe it's not asking the deep questions and expecting deep answers, but it's that simple human interaction. And in those simple interactions, they create connections, and those connections open up and disclose something of the power and the holiness that is within each one of us and within our relations to one another. I think in those simple meals and those ordinary interactions, we have a day-to-day example of the very Eucharistic feast that we're all going to be enjoying in just a few minutes. We have a small R resurrection in those opportunities to connect and to share. And that is a wonderful blessing and something that we are reminded of in the readings today. And they are wonderful readings and powerful readings. You know, and of course, that phrase that I started with from Hebrews, let our mutual love abide, not necessarily in the big things, but in the little things. Be hospitable. Open yourself up to the holy disclosing presence of those around us, because in doing so, some have entertained angels in our midst. Well, the reading from the Gospel according to St. Luke talks today of a couple of parables. I use those in scare quotes, parables about hospitality and about a meal. And they're parables that are not really parables. And what do I mean by that? A parable, as we all know from reading the scriptures, a parable is a story that doesn't address something directly, but it tells a story that moves around and goes in a little bit of this direction, that direction, to get to an essential message that is deeper than the details of the story itself. Well, this parable, or these two parables about a meal, about guests at a meal in the first case and about a host of a meal in the second case, are not parables in that sense. They're almost lectures of Jesus saying, this is what you do when you're in this situation. It's not really a parable, it's not really a story. It is more like a proverb or a psalm. It's a piece of wisdom that Jesus is using, and the gospel, according to St. Luke, the author of that gospel, is trying to show by using this wisdom language that Jesus is part of this Old Testament Hebrew scripture tradition of wisdom that we have coming from the prophets, that Jesus himself is in that teaching sort of mode. But scholars also say about these two parables that are not really parables, that the very conditions in which Jesus tells them at a meal that was put on by a Pharisee for a number of guests is itself not just an ordinary meal, but is what would be considered in Greco-Roman times and Hellenized times would be considered a symposium, or what we might think of today as a book group. Are any of you in book groups? Oh, 2 of you are in book groups. I know more than that are in book groups. But it's the ancient Near East version, Hellenized Greco-Roman version of a book group, which is you get a group of people together, you have a meal, and then you discuss a book, or in the case of a symposium, a deep philosophical concept. In this case, what hospitality means. And the first example that Jesus, so what's happening here is Jesus, according to the author of Luke, Jesus is combining the very best of the Old Testament tradition of wisdom and of prophecy with the Western tradition of the philosopher, and melding these two traditions to take us to something that we might think of as being very high and lofty, but is very intrinsic and basic to human existence itself. And Jesus, so that with that background, Jesus says his piece of wisdom. His piece of wisdom is this. He says, don't show up at a meal that you've been invited to and do what? Step over each other to get to the seat of honor. Don't push and move people aside in order that you can be seen by others as being somehow above them and more important by where you're sitting. Jesus says, don't do that. Don't do that. Well, as Episcopalians, we know that would be, it's extra biblical here, but we know that would just be bad form, right? That would be bad taste. But Jesus is getting to something that's very basic, and very important for us to think about in the context of modern life. Sometimes we think of these meals and things we go to as places of professional development or networking or something like that. That there's an instrumentality to the meal and the connection with other people. And that the person who gets the better of the other person is somehow better or above that other person. And Jesus, representing both the Old Testament wisdom tradition and the Western philosophical tradition, says, no, that's not how we do things. The Christian ethos is not life is a ladder and we step over other people to get higher on the ladder above them. And by the way, after the early service this morning, a congregant comes up to me and she says, my father had a saying he used to share, and it was, be careful who you step on the ladder going up, because those are going to be the same people who are holding the ladder when you come down. But see, that's the whole issue, is it's a way of seeing connecting with other people, in this case, in the course of a meal, as being something that involves a hierarchy. And Jesus says, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who are humble will be exalted. So the Christian way of thinking inverts the ladder. It inverts it. It says, life is not a zero-sum game. The person with the most things and the most toys and the most acknowledgement by their peers wins something. He says the purpose of life is to be with other people and to lift other people up. For when you're given an opportunity to step in front of somebody, you say no, and you let the person on your left or you let the person on your right, you move them forward and you step back. That's the Christian logic. That's the Christian difference here. It's both philosophical and it's theological. It's based on this idea that we may be entertaining angels amongst us, and that every human being is an invaluable child of God, a human soul that is worthy of honor and praise and respect, and we don't get ahead by pushing people behind us, but we get ahead by everybody rises when we lift each other up and give each other a hand. Is that true? That is true. We know it's true based on our experience with other people. That's our ethos. We all rise when we have compassion and kindness and we express that to other people. We feel better about ourselves because we're built that way. We're not built to step on other people. We're built to lift other people up. And Jesus uses the context of a meal and the notion of hospitality to make that point in the first parable that's not a parable. The second parable that's not a parable, the first one is about the guests and how they're behaving or not behaving and how they should behave. The second portion of this is the story about the host. And Jesus says, if you're hosting a party, don't invite your friends, don't invite all the wealthy people in town, don't invite all the important people who, by inviting them, you know that you're going to get an invitation back and that it's going to be a quid pro quo. Again, an instrumentality way of thinking about invaluable human souls. Jesus says, instead of that, what do? We invite the sick, the poor, the lame, and the blind. Those are the classes of people that Jesus talks about. And we know what he's saying here is don't give a meal and host something in order to puff yourself up. But Jesus is being very practical. He's saying, you guys don't need another meal to fill your belly. Your friends don't need another meal. You know what you need to do? You need to be very practical. You need to show compassion to those who are less fortunate than you and have less things. So you invite the very people that can't give you something back except for the thing that cannot be bought. The very thing that we're talking about in the beginning of this sermon, which is that human connection, that moment of holiness, and that opportunity to be with other people, that serendipity of togetherness where the holiness can arise and disclose itself out of the very interactions themselves. Not something for something else, but something without any expectation of anything else. And that's when the real magic and love and excitement happens. Now, these readings about hospitality, about compassion for the other, and so forth have been heavily on my mind this week. Started praying them right after the sermon from last Sunday, reading them and figuring out what I was going to say today. And between last week and this week, a group of 8 of us from Grace Cathedral made a mission visit to the border. And we did so because we wanted to see what conditions were like with those who are seeking asylum and coming from war-torn and violence-torn areas of Central America, principally they call the Golden Triangle of Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. And you might remember this whole kind of interest in this started about 5 years ago with there was a migrant caravan. Do you remember that? It made all the newspapers, the migrant caravan of people. And at the time, there was a lot of negative press and negative publicity to this, of like, oh, we're going to be invaded by all these people that are coming up from Central America, and they're scary, bad people, and they do bad things and everything. And back then I was in another parish, and I'm like, man, I don't know what to think. So you know what I did? I joined a group of people that went to the border to meet that group of those folks in that migrant caravan, because I wanted to see with my own eyes and understand from the inside what was really happening. And so it'd been a few years since I'd done this, so I got some folks together in the congregation here and said, you know what, this has fallen out of the news, but it's not like the conditions that created those migrant caravans just recently have gone away. People are still piling up at the border. Families have been making these treacherous journeys from Central America, except for it's not making the newspaper. We need to find out how things are. And wouldn't you know, this is Grace Cathedral. This is Grace Cathedral. And wouldn't you know it, there was great interest in going back down and checking out what was happening right now and today. And it was very gratifying and wonderful to see. This is a committed group of folks. You already know that. But not every place is like that, and not every place stands up for these values of hospitality and openness that we read of from Jesus' own words today. So we made this visit down there. It was a quick visit to the border, but we joined a group, and listen, I don't have any great pearls of wisdom to drop. There is a crisis at the border. This is related to immigration. It's related to asylum seeking. It's related to politics in Latin America, and these things are complex and variegated and difficult to pick apart. I don't have any simple answers to this. I don't. But I want to be part of the solution. I want to be part of the solution. I know you all want to be part of the solution too, where we're not demonizing people, but understanding that every human life is an invaluable soul, a child of God, and that those strangers whom we offer hospitality to, among them are angels. So we took this trip there, and I will only share one experience. The other folks are going to share, who were on this trip, are going to share more. I'm still internally processing what we saw, but here's what I saw. We went to what is now one of the largest shelters for migrant families, and our van couldn't make it because the road was so bad. We had to walk about 200 yards to get from where we could get to with our van to the shelter itself. And we're walking over this rocky road, and right down the middle of the road is a stream, and that stream stinks. That stream is effluence of human waste. And so we walk up, and we get to the shelter. It's out of a fundamentalist church that is opened, out of the goodness of its heart, has opened its doors and is now housing about 1,700 people, men, women, and children, families who have made this treacherous journey, who've been through unspeakable difficulties and violence in their home countries and have gone through just a horrible trip in order to get even to these awful conditions in which they now find themselves. But this is the one experience that I want to leave you with about the power, and it goes to the power of hospitality. It goes to the power of small changes in spite of the complex and difficult issues that face our world today. We go up to the shelter, and right next to the shelter is an early education center set up by Pila Global, which is the group that hosted us. And amidst this scariness, for me, scary, and misery that's surrounding us, what do we hear? The sound of laughing children's voices. In that phrase that I started this with, show hospitality to strangers because you never know. There may be angels amongst us, came to mind, and that truth hit home. Because, boy, I tell you, if there are angels amongst us, it's our children, aren't they? Isn't it? It's our children. And I know that whatever's happening with the difficulties of these families, something right is happening at this education center and the work that Pila Global is doing. Because what they're doing is bringing joy and laughter to children who've known nothing but difficulty and misery. And we go into this education center set up by Pila, and you know what it looks like? It looks like the community preschool here at Grace Cathedral. Pila has done what the gospel is talking about today, which is, maybe we can't change and transform the big things all at once, and it's a process, and there are many layers of complexity to it, but you know what we can do? We can make a difference, one person, or in their case, one child at a time. They have set up these classrooms that PILA stands for Pedagogical Institute of Los Angeles. Their former executive director was retiring. They gave her a trip to the Mediterranean. She and her husband got off in Greece, and they wanted to go and see a Syrian refugee center set up on one of the Greek Isles. And immediately, the former executive director, Elise Schaefer-Ivy, said, "I'm coming out of retirement." It's like one of those football players or basketball players. "I'm coming out of retirement." We're going to do, in some small way, what we're doing for folks in LA, and it's going to look the same in Syria. And they said, when I'm in Syria, in Congo, and here on our own southern border, doing play and reading books and singing songs and making changes in individual lives in small but important ways, helping to heal some of that. Trauma maybe is an overused word. It's not overused there. It's real, that trauma, helping to heal the brokenness that's in this life. So I have nothing but, amidst all the scariness and all the complexity and everything else, I have nothing but joyful news to share with you, and it's going to be shared by more folks who went on this mission trip, and this won't be the last mission trip that we take there. But it gets to the very thing that Jesus is talking about in the gospel today. We can't maybe change everything, but we can change some things. We can help, and we can make a difference. And we know that is true when we open ourselves and have hearts of hospitality to be the change and to make the difference. And in small ways, whether that's in supporting a small nonprofit, doing work right next to large shelters, or whether that's opening up our meals and serving meals with grace to people in SROs just down the hill, or whether that's some individual way in each one of your lives during the course of the week where you can sit down, make space, do what the Hawaiians call talk story, be with each other, put the other person forward, not yourself. And then we will truly host the angels in our midst. Amen.